Hello everyone and welcome to Internally Screening, where today we're going to be doing our review of Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, directed by Zack Snyder, with Sofia Boutella, Jimon Hansu, a bunch of other people. You may have seen our review of the first part of this film. If we don't seem overly enthusiastic, you should probably visit that review first before you watch this one, because I think a lot of the same criticisms may end up applying.
They will.
And we are working on a larger Zack Snyder video coming up soon. But Rebel Moon takes place immediately after Rebel Moon 1, pretty much exactly where you leave off from the first film.
It's not a sequel so much as it is the second half.
It is literally...
Which is as advertised.
Yes, that's true. What did you think of Rebel Moon Part 2?
Well, I think what's interesting is that I think you could kind of anticipate, and we were talking about the structure briefly, of how the two halves of the film were going to function, in that it was leading us to this place where we were going to have this big final kind of conclusive battle between good and evil, between space Nazis and space farmers, and it does it in a very unspectacular, formulaic way. I think a big problem about what was wrong with the first film was just that it was kind of really scattershot. You didn't really get enough time to spend with each character and kind of uncovering what made them important, what made them tick. They were all just kind of very surface level, one-dimensional characters made to suit a specific niche, but it was all very facile. But you did at least get a lot of sprawling environments and like different locales and things like that. Like, it was visually cluttered, but its problem kind of came from it was trying to do too much in too little time. And this is kind of the opposite, in that it feels very sluggish and predictable and mundane. It's almost exactly what you would predict from it, and that there's not really much in the way of excitement and sort of grandeur, even though it's implied. I mean, the film is 2 hours long. An hour of that is a big battle, so you would imagine that it's like sort of balls to the wall kind of explosive. And while it has those elements to it, it's done in just such like a derivative, generic fashion. Like, it's surprisingly mundane for how much action is going on in it.
Yeah, I mean, what I found interesting was that what I was expecting, because the first film is almost exclusively set up, that's kind of what makes a big problem with the first film, is that it genuinely just feels like act one of a film, in so much as you get all your characters together and then they have their first fight. But typically what happens and we were comparing it a lot to Star Wars, right?
Sure.
And when you look at Star Wars, you have all your characters get together early on in the film, they go and have their first fight thing on the Death Star, and that sort of feels like where it cuts off in Rebel Moon. It's like if they ended it there, that would be the end.
And then a whole film dedicated to the trench run at the Death Star.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this film is like, it kind of misses out. There's like another bit of Star Wars in between the bit where they do the trench run, where the characters are actually hanging out and talking about stuff. Like, sorry, this is a terrible comparison, but
if you're framing it structurally as kind of parallel,
if you're framing it as parallel. What's beautiful about that Death Star bit is the characters, through the action, get to know each other really well, and you have all of this like character building stuff where like Han's quipping, Princess Leia and Luke going off and doing stuff, and like Chewbacca's doing silly stuff on Death Star. Even though it's an action scene, it's actually like a really well constructed bit where the characters get to interact with each other, and you learn a lot about the characters, and the dynamic between the characters is really clearly established.
Sure.
Whereas you never get that in Rebel Moon. So I was kind of hoping that in the first half of this film, we were going to get that. But instead what we get is essentially almost a rerun of the first film. Instead of building on what the first film was already done, it instead sort of just repeats what we got from the first film, where we start on the wheat planet, they're stressed about the wheat, we get a lot of wheat shots, a lot of slow motion wheat, lots of very golden hour wheat, slow motion wheat. We get pretty much every form of wheat under the sun, and under every form of sun shot that you can get, so the wheat can dramatically silhouette against the sun. But the only extra character building we actually get in the film, outside of Sofia Boutella's character kind of moping around a lot, are the extra flashbacks we get. This film even settles into the exact same structure as the first one, because in the first one you had the very segmented, here's this character, here's this character, here's this character, here's this character, and then we have a big fight. This film basically does the same thing where...
in fast forward.
Yeah, but they go and sit around a table and have a flashback each, and then the film just goes into the big fight. So you don't ever get that kind of connective glue where you actually get a sense of who these characters are, how they feel about each other. Like, you tell me, how does Jimon Hansu's character feel about Sofia Boutella's character in this film?
Yeah.
They're like acquaintances.
Yeah, that's it.
But then if I told you how does Luke Skywalker feel about Chewbacca? That's like a relationship that I can immediately, even though it's not like one of the main relationships,
right?
Like you can picture in your mind what it would be like if Luke Skywalker and Chewbacca were hanging out.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get you.
That's pretty much the core problem of this film, is that it doesn't introduce any characters, and neither did the first film, beyond introducing essentially cool action figures that Zack Snyder basically uses as substitutes for characters.
Yes, essentially he introduced a bunch of very paper-thin characters and had the opportunity to flesh them out and get them to interact with one another and build a rapport. Not just re-establish those characters, but build them into new things and have their arcs kind of grow and flourish. And instead, yeah, like you say, through the use of flashbacks, it's just this sort of cyclical thing of here I am, here's my story.
Yeah.
And there's
never
never
the same story every time.
It's the same story. It's like the bad army did this thing to me. Oh, the bad army did this thing to me. I was a general, they killed all my people. Oh, I was a prince, they killed all my people. Oh, I was living in a village, they killed all my people.
Yeah, literally.
It's particularly embarrassing in terms of the structural framework of this film because, yeah, it's like a 2-hour film. The last half of it is the action scene, but the first half is like some of the most meandering, boring nonsense you've ever seen. So it's split into what I would call like 3 distinct sections. Your first is a sort of brief overview of what just happened in the first film, with Anthony Hopkins' Bot giving us our like regurgitated backstory.
And we get a flashback to Sophia Botella's past.
Yeah, we get Ed Skrein kind of coming back to life in like a big cocoon that looks very like when Frodo is stuck in like the spider's web. Then you have, I can't remember which order it happens, but you have flashback montage into wheat montage, which is kind of crazy.
Well, I think you have wheat montage. The wheat montages. The wheat montages are kind of the real glue of the first act of the film, because they're happening constantly, and when they're happening, they feel like they're happening forever. We had a joke in the first review about like how long they talk about the wheat. Right. And like the surplus of the grain.
Yeah.
And we already went into all the problems with that. Like, number one, why do these space Nazis want wheat so bad? This film doesn't go into any detail as to why the fuck they want the wheat so bad, other than that they just need it.
Yeah, I mean, they do. There are lines about them needing it because the supply lines have been hit.
Yeah,
but like, why this one planet?
But in film speak, that's we need it because we need it.
Yeah, and it's just a convenience. And also, you could then go into why have they picked a planet that only has seemingly like 100, 200 people on it? How are they supposed to feed an empire full of people?
Like we did all of this in the first review. We made a joke about it, and what's so interesting is this film like really doubles down on that one element of the film. Like, no, the boring wheat stuff from the first film, that is really the core of this setup.
Yeah, let's have like a big 10-minute montage of people farming, just so you know how important it is.
And like, and this sort of comes back to Zack Snyder's bad directing in this film, is that the way that it shoots the wheat makes the wheat seem like it is the most magical, important thing ever. Like every shot is like slow motion, golden rays of light and lens flares going through little tiny little grains of wheat in the air, and it goes into slow motion, and like there's people like holding the wheat almost sort of tenderly and sensually, like they have hands through the wheat, and it's this beautiful majestical thing. And the film never ever goes to any length narratively or even really visually, outside of just like, oh, it shows you the wheat and it's a nice shot of some wheat, never communicates what it is that the wheat means, how it connects to the characters and how that connects to the wider story. You could probably have a film where wheat, or like, you know, the growth of crops generally, is a meaningful motif in the film.
Sure.
And makes sense and has like real, genuine emotional meaning, and you could connect that to a wider narrative. But this film doesn't do that. So it's a choice that I haven't really been able to get my head around, because it's so incongruous with the rest of the film, where the rest of the film is ostensibly interested in blowing up a big spaceship.
Well, isn't Zack Snyder supposed to be a big libertarian?
Yes.
Well, isn't it that he's basically found like a self-sustaining people that live by their own rules?
Okay,
the wheat is theirs, they live off the wheat. Then a big nasty
so
government
the wheat represents
comes along.
freedom.
Yeah,
right,
then a big nasty government comes along and says, that's our wheat now. But
it's the government.
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay. See, now that's an interesting one, yeah. Obviously, it always comes back to Ayn Rand and libertarianism with Zack Snyder, which is basically
like you can read a libertarian reading of basically every film he's ever done.
Yeah, you're totally right. I don't know how I didn't really catch that, because also like the imagery of farmers and like, you know, like conservatives and libertarians are always like harken to, oh, the farmers like, aren't they basically great because they're so self-sustainable and like they produce their own stuff and live off the land, and it's this sort of romanticised idea. That is very interesting. I can't believe I didn't catch that. But then ultimately the film doesn't really say anything that interesting about freedom.
No, it certainly does not.
Because maybe some people can find like a level of emotional depth in this film or something interesting this film has to say, but ultimately it just feels like someone going, these are the good guys, because I said they're the good guys, these are the bad guys who act villainous without any interesting reason to do so, or any world building to make it at least like look really cool or be evil. Like there's no, like, the lore isn't interesting enough or detailed enough to really like fill us in on like why they're being evil, or it all ultimately crumbles because then it just comes down to just a big fight scene where you're not interested in any of the characters participating in it.
Yeah, so I mean, digging into the action side of things, it's kind of hard to like think of big moments that like really stick in my mind. There are a couple though, like, so basically when it starts off, the Nazis land in kind of little sort of smaller things. Yeah, like they're at the sort of foot of the village. They come to meet Sofia Boutella and Michael Huisman, however you say his name. I'm sure we've been butchering his name the whole time, but whatever, we'll keep going with it. They go to meet them, and then the ultimatum is passed, like, Sofia Boutella, so you sacrifice yourself and we'll leave this village alone because you're more valuable than anything in this village.
Yes.
We assume it's like a double bluff and they'll just take anything they want from the village anyway, but on a character logic level it makes sense, and she agrees.
Yeah.
But then Michael Huisman, who loves her, is like, nah, fuck this shit.
With a
steals her gun and shoots her. And then you have, what I think is one of my favourite bits is that they've dug like a trench and some guy pops up with a rocket and shoots like one of the ships. And it's just like a really abrupt, kind of almost, so abrupt as to almost be funny moment of breaking of tension.
I personally didn't really get anything from that, but it was an interesting moment in so much as you can kind of see like, oh, this is going to be the defense of the village bit. There's so much, like, you could do so much here, like, action-wise. Like, are the villagers going to be acting like guerrilla fighters?
Yeah,
are they going to have,
Vietnam
like,
style,
some interesting traps that they're going to use where you can, like, contrast, like, this military powers, like, massive guns and tanks versus, like, their sturdy farm equipment.
Yeah, and their knowledge of the land and, like, using the environment to their advantage.
But of course the answer to that is no, they just shoot at each other for the most part.
They have a trench.
Yeah.
And the most use it gets out of it is that opening bit. There is a cool bit where Ed Skrein goes down and does like a Superman pose into the ground and starts punching people. It's stupid, but like the film was giving me so little in terms of like an emotional reaction, be it to the action, be it to the characters, that when it was doing something goofy, that's when I was the most invested, because I was like, oh, it's doing something like with personality.
Well, at the risk of going on a tangent, what you said there, we kind of already said that in part one, where we were talking about how Ed Skrein was one of the more interesting characters in so much as he was being goofy.
Yes.
And
he had personality and he was giving something to the character.
And a real letdown in this film, we've already kind of spoken about, there's almost nothing to say, weirdly, about the characters.
Yeah.
In terms of what this film presents us, because it is just the same as the
first. It's 100% the same.
One of the big letdowns for me was how little they did with Ed Skrein's character in this. Because obviously in the first film, spoilers for Rebel Moon Part 1, obviously, he dies and then gets brought back in a really dramatic way. There's this like scene where he's being spoken to by the like fake emperor or whatever, the Scottish guy or whatever,
the Northern Irish guy.
Yeah, is he an Irish?
I think so. I think he is.
He's like, you better not fuck it up this time. And then weirdly in this film, he's weirdly, like, his character hasn't really changed. He seems a little bit more muted, if anything.
Yeah, I mean,
because I guess he's been humbled, and that's kind of
perhaps. But what's kind of bizarre is that they give him very little new stuff to do on a character level. He is basically just there to be the big bad guy and to have a showdown with Sofia Boutella at the end. But they went to all this effort to bring him back. And like, if you were to see it as this holistic full film that Zack Snyder was compelled by Netflix to cut in half, on a narrative level, why would you you bring back your main villain for him then to do nothing for the rest of the film other than just sort of stoically repeat, like, we must capture these guys, and then get killed again?
Yeah, and so much emphasis is placed on the fact that he was killed in the previous film. Obviously, the title, The Scargiver, comes from the fact that he's healed in this Bacta tank, and he has a scar now, which doesn't make any sense because... Like, his arm was broken, his teeth were knocked out, and for some reason this one part just doesn't heal.
But he chooses to keep it.
But he's like, oh, I won't heal this because I'm fucking gonna kill Sofia Boutella. She's the scar giver.
I think she had that nickname beforehand.
Did she?
Yes, I think the character has the nickname of Scar Giver. I'm pretty sure he refers to her as such in the first film. But then it's like, this is apt. I have a scar from the Scar Giver herself.
Oh, right.
I think it's that.
The element of revenge, obviously, it kind of ultimately just comes down to the fact his motivation is like, the only reason he wants to kill her is that she killed him the first time. There's no further depth to their relationship.
Well, he's just commanded to kill her.
And he's commanded to kill her. But there's no like further depth. Like, so when he's trying to kill her, his whole logic is like, well, I have to kill her because she killed me before. Whereas, compare that maybe to the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Kylo Ren wanting to kill Rey at the end of The Last Jedi. The fact that those characters actually have like an interaction. And an actual relationship that is more than just, you beat me, now I want to beat you.
Sure.
Kind of adds a level of depth to it. So I don't really understand the emphasis on the whole Scar Giver thing.
Yeah, and given that they then don't really take it anywhere.
And the amount of time they spend on building up this, like, oh, well, I have to kill her now type shit that he's got going on.
Yeah, spoilers, he does die.
Again.
They're
just going to bring him back again.
I would assume this time it's more final. The way that it happens implies it's much more final.
It'd be funny if every film they just keep bringing him back.
I would quite like that.
You can't fuck it up this time, we're on Rebel Moon 7!
He's literally just like patchwork, like falling apart, like, kill me. I would actually admire Zack Snyder a whole lot if he did that. I think it'd be really funny.
It's like they bring back like an army of Ed screens.
That would be so good. No, you know what, that
like
works.
The Master in Doctor Who.
Does that work in like a libertarian context of like, oh, you know, kind of like Hydra, you cut off the head of the snake and another head grows back. Like, you know, you can try and get rid of government control, but the government always come back.
I guess you could kind of read it like, he's, even as the commander, he's not even free to die because he works for the government.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. That's good. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, again, so the final action scene that he's in, where you have your standoff, the ship is crashing. We've kind of fast forwarded.
Well, so first off, they trick the ship into taking them in. It's basically the exact same as Star Wars again, where the Millennium Falcon.
They radio in, they fake the...
Yeah, and then they land. So they go in, they go around dropping a bunch of bombs inside the ship, and then they're like about to shoot the village with a giant gun. They're going to like... Because they've sent troops down for some reason to try and do it manually.
Yeah. Well, they want the wheat, so they actually set it up in the first half of the film in that Jimon House is like...
Just use a slightly smaller missile.
The wheat is your protector. It's like our bargaining, but also it can be a literal physical defense. In that, if you have the wheat in your homes, in the buildings, they can't blow up these buildings because otherwise they destroy everything thereafter. So they basically finally have to resort to the artillery at the end because they've been bested on like a man-to-man military level. Yeah. But yeah, like you say, just as the artillery is going to fire down onto the planet, the bombs go off and the ship starts like going into free fall. Yes. And then we get...
There's a big slidey fight where basically...
There's a big sliding fight.
If you've seen the trailer for the film, you've probably seen a shot of this where they're on a giant slidey surface, presumably a ship hangar of some kind,
hangar,
where you have obviously a ton of debris falling with them. It's a cool idea.
Yeah, I think it's a
and I kind of like the setup of a ship falling through the atmosphere and smashing into the ground. But ultimately, I just didn't think the execution of it was really all that special. There was no wow moment that was cool. Do you know what I mean?
I think it was one of the better pieces of action in the film, and it was fairly well done. But in terms of like maximizing the promise of your concept, of like the potential of it, it felt kind of half-baked. Like you could have taken it in way more...
It was like
a lot more interesting ways you could have portrayed that. Like it was visually plain.
It was okay.
Yeah. But you got some cool kind of things things of like them trying to fight one another as they fall down. They get to another bit and they fall.
Yeah, I mean that's a nice idea, but I don't really feel like any of the execution is there in the end. I don't really actually think there's a standout piece of action in this whole film, to be completely honest. There's a whole bunch of little action set pieces within the giant fight scene.
Yeah.
So like there's a bit where a woman's trying to blow up a tank, and then there's like the weird return of the Anthony Hopkins robot, who is sort of lurking on the outskirts of the town, and then with deer antlers tied to his head, and he just sort of speaks in philosophical riddles and just decides to show up because they think that the princess is still alive, who was the one who Sophia Boutella murders in the flashback at the beginning of the film.
Yes.
And he's like, oh, if she's still alive, I must help you. So then he like just randomly shows up and just shoots a bunch of people.
It's weirdly reminiscent of like sort of Man of Steel type stuff. Like he rocks up, and I think it's probably because he's like the only CGI character.
Yeah.
It suddenly goes kind of rubbery plastic mode where he's sort of jumping and flinging himself across really like the place. Yeah. I've seen some people point to this, people who didn't like the film, and say this was still their like favourite bit, like when he rocks up. But I didn't get that at all.
No,
like,
I thought it was really, really lame.
I didn't hate it quite that much.
He's literally a Deus Ex Machina.
He is a bit of a Deus Ex Machina, and he is a robot. But
and he comes from God because Zack Snyder wrote him.
But yeah, it just wasn't. It was just another thing that happens. That's kind of okay. You could have done something a bit more with that. I think.
Why wasn't he like just part of the fight to start with?
Yeah.
It doesn't really work as a late film reveal. Like, oh my god, I never thought that was going to happen type thing.
Yeah.
To me, it would have just made more sense of if this robot is going to be a character in this series going forward, why not have him hang out and do stuff, and then we can like learn a bit more about this robot? Because the only other time we've encountered this robot is right at the beginning of the first film, and we didn't really even learn much about him there.
Yeah, again, like his character is basically just constantly reaffirming that I was built to serve the king and queen. The king and queen are dead. I feel purposeless. And then he's like, well, actually, I don't feel purposeless because I think that the princess is still alive.
Yeah.
And then that seems to be what drives him back down. I could be slightly misconstruing the story there, but
that's the long and short of it.
I think that is essentially the long and short of it. But again, it's this thing of like characters kind of just repeating themselves in terms of here are my motivations, here's why I'm doing these things, but they're never really going beyond those very surface quick descriptions of themselves. Like it's like the characters were asked to describe themselves in 2 sentences or less, and then that's all the dialogue they really get throughout the film.
Yeah.
But one of the more important things you alluded to in there, which again I guess a tangent away from the action, is that important flashback which we find of Sophia Boutella, the reveal being that she was the one sent to assassinate the king, queen and princess.
Was the low point of the whole film, despite being arguably one of the more interesting elements narratively.
Sure.
This should be so important. This is showing us where the main character's turn happened.
Yeah.
Where she went from being an evil servant of this like uncaring totalitarian army to her own person, and ended up, you know, going off to be this like hero of the people. It's like so important, and it's kind of hard to quantify and criticise exactly what it is about this scene that's so bad, but there are a few things I can point to. The whole setup of the scene is incredibly weak. So the king and queen land with their sort of posse of people and their daughter and the main character, who's sort of their main bodyguard, protector of the child. She's like entrusted with the protection of this child, this magical child, who can like bring people back from the dead or something. They then walk through this weird hangar area where you have a bunch of people in masks playing the violin.
Yeah.
Initially you think it's like non-diegetic music, you're like, oh, it's this like dramatic thing, and then it's like, oh no, they're actually playing it. Oh wow. And there's something about that is just, maybe I'm just being a hater here.
Well, it gets more cartoonish because as the fight then goes on,
they start
playing more dramatically to it. Like,
And then there's an element that we were actually just confused about, and we had to go back and check, and we're not entirely clear. I thought that they didn't have bodyguards, and this is part of why the setup for this scene is just so weird and confusing. I thought that they showed up without bodyguards, and I was like, well, it's really weird in a film like this. These are like the most important people in this universe. Why are they not here with bodyguards? And Adam said, they do have bodyguards in the film. So we went back and checked, and there are 2 people there who look a bit like bodyguards, and then when the fight ensues, stand there doing nothing.
Yeah, and then Sofia Boutella shoots them while they're standing still.
So we're sort of inconclusive.
I am quite confused. Yeah. I was certain they must be bodyguards, but yeah. But anyway, like,
and you'd be forgiven for thinking so.
Yeah,
because it would be insane to do that scene in such a weird, unconvincing way.
But like the choreography of the scene is just quite sloppy and unremarkable. But then you have the turn at the end when the king and queen have been felled. Sofia Boutella is compelled to kill the child. She shoots the child.
And the evil guy's like, do it now! Kill the child!
Yeah, in a room full of everyone, he's like, yeah, kill her, do it. And then as soon as she does it, he goes, that's a traitor. Kill that traitor. She just killed the princess and the king and queen. You all deserve. I apologise for my accent.
And better than the one I did in the previous review.
Yeah. But it just struck me as like so horribly cartoonish in this really a scene that's attempting to be so dramatic that someone would do a turn like that. It just felt like the worst possible way of conveying that.
It's cartoonish. That's
why wouldn't you reframe the scene where Space Hitler isn't there and it is just Sofia Boutella, and then she reports back her crime and then he turns it, because he's like red-handed. He's literally got the knife in his hands that was, it just seems really stupid.
Well, I guess the reason, if it's a choice that's been made on purpose, and I think it probably is it's to emphasise, well, he's such a totalitarian ruler that they're just going to go along with it. But that just feels... Because we don't really actually know anything about this guy. He was in the first film for all of like 5 minutes.
Yes.
If that.
If that.
Like, genuinely, possibly like sub 5 minutes worth of screen time. And he's only sort of peripherally been referred to as like, oh, there's that guy behind the scenes and he's evil. So you see him and he does this, and it's just hard to buy into, because like, who is he and why are we suddenly expected to believe that that's how things would roll out in this universe, because there's no precedent set for it.
Yeah, I mean, I can completely agree with the idea of like, he's supposed to be so evil and so powerful in this room full of people that have seen him commit a crime. He can then turn around and say, she did it, and they'll all go along with it, and she's the scapegoat. Like, I don't have a problem with that in terms of this story, but in terms of execution, it just comes off as really goofy and silly, and this really important turning point scene just comes across as incredibly goofy.
Yeah, and I think that Carrie Elwes like cameo does no favours for the film either, because it's just like it heightened that scene is almost comical.
Well, it just does it draw you right to
he's just like there like,
Bride.
What are you doing? I'm the king. It's just like, it feels like it was one of those moments in the film where it was obviously this is what films are, but I came sort of acutely aware of the fact that this is a bunch of adults dressing up.
Right. I guess but I mean the best films take you away from that. That's what you lose yourself in film. That's the whole kind of concept of the thing. And it's like the differentiation between when you see someone acting decently but you're like, I see the actor. I mean, in this whole review we have been referring to Sofia Boutella by her by her name,
the character's name,
because the character has left such a little impression on us. But then you see someone like Daniel Day-Lewis. I mean, he's a predictable example, sure, but like he becomes his character.
I never see Daniel Day-Lewis in a film.
So it's those divisions of, sure, it is all just actors on a screen doing goofy shit, but it's how well can a film bring you into that world.
And I mean, ultimately, it always comes back to the fact that this film just has so little interest in its characters, because, like I said, this scene that we're talking about, it's the most important scene in both films. It's like the whole turning point, and it actually doesn't really tell you anything about the character other than she hesitated to kill the girl. So it's not like we really get much of a sense of what Sofia Boutella's character was like when she was evil, because we get one flashback in the first film to her doing army stuff, not even doing anything particularly evil, by the way, literally like her on a battlefield holding a flag.
Yes.
Then we get this scene where she tearfully executes a child after she says, I forgive you. So she's basically the same character through the whole film. We never see like, but she used to be really fucked up, because the film never actually shows you that she was.
Well, I remember, immediately after watching that scene, I was like, wow, she's actually guilty of regicide. So she has done something that is a step beyond your regular Nazi following orders. She is responsible for one of the most dramatic and important deaths in this universe. I wonder if the character will face moral or physical repercussions for this. Like, what will happen to this character? What kind of journey will she go on from this point?
Really care.
And it doesn't really delve into it. It's like, oh, well, she feels guilty, but that's kind of the majority of
Well, so much of the film's like, well, she's such a great person. And it's look at her cuddling her hot boyfriend and caring about the kids in the village. She's going to sacrifice herself, but her hot boyfriend loves her too much because she's so great. Like, tell me a trait of this character without saying, like, brave and strong.
Teary-eyed.
Teary-eyed, that's a good point. She does cry a lot in this film.
She does.
She cries a hell of a lot.
It's just it's like melodrama, but with like nothing really to attach itself to. Like these hollow plastic shells of characters, they're just really unremarkable. And yeah, when the script has an opportunity to go, here's something awful she did, let's really dive deep down into her psyche and like how she overcomes this, either internally or externally. Like what repercussions will she face? I mean
that scene is almost, it never really gets referred to again, other than it's like, we gotta go, she's alive somehow.
Right.
Like that, and you were even hypothesizing, oh well, the little girl's going to be powering the ship. And that would have been kind of interesting, because obviously the whole thing was like, Ed Skrein's character gets brought back to life.
Yeah.
And we knew that the little girl
had the life
bring back power. So when you said that, I was like, oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So they've got like a little girl powering the bringing back to life engine. That could be like an interesting...
Well, that would be very Warhammer, which would have been a much more interesting
sacrificing souls to the Golden Throne. Yeah.
It would have been a much more interesting influence to draw upon than your bog standard Star Wars references. I mean, look, at the end of the day, everyone has rightfully been comparing these films to Star Wars because, by rights, it was a Star Wars script that has been readapted back into original material, and it is just subpar Star Wars on every conceivable level. It has diluted everything that was compelling about those films, or even indeed just that original film, because like we were saying, there are so many parallels to it structurally. You've just drawn every interesting thing out of that, and like you're left with this like incredibly hollow and unremarkable experience.
Yeah, it's like eating like a 50-50 Hovis slice of bread by itself, because it's like, it's not even
it's not
like
as nutritious as wholemeal or tasty as white bread.
It's just like bleh. And it shouldn't be, because for everything we said in our previous review of Rebel Moon, and we're probably saying this too late in the review for anybody who's going to care, but I actually have so much respect for Zack Snyder as a filmmaker, and I think well, we'll probably go into this more when we do our tier list, but he's genuinely probably top 5 most important filmmakers in terms of popular appeal of our lifetime.
Yeah,
genuinely.
Well, I mean, the cult of Snyder existing is kind of testament to that.
And his commercial success with these films and his influence, I think, is like something that's genuinely, even if you don't like his stuff, it's worth really, really taking seriously. By all accounts, this film takes itself very seriously, so I don't feel like it's unfair of us to kind of hold it to that standard.
Yeah.
And when it's insisting that things within this film are really important or really dramatic, or have this grand meaning to them, like looking at that a bit harder and just like, I'm not just dumping on Zack Snyder, but it really does feel, even like compared to pretty much all of his other films, weirdly like low effort.
Well, it feels, as you said in the first review, incredibly cynical.
Yes.
Like, it feels like this was designed to be a product, to be IP, to sell lots of things around it, which ostensibly it was, which seemingly now has fallen flat on its ass, because we talked a lot about board games and things that apparently they're not going to happen anymore.
Games,
Like, I don't know how much of that, extended universe
there were
stuff.
supposed to be 6 of these films.
Yes, and that's a new thing that's come out since the wake of this film is,
And I would be, honestly, do you think this film will get another one? This series will get another Rebel Moon?
Well, we can't know, because the way Netflix handles its box office stuff is all kind of behind closed doors. They like to tell us that things are very popular, but
we have to take their word for it.
We have to take their word for it. I mean, they told us that Bright, do you remember Bright?
Yeah.
They told us Bright was like a super popular smash hit, but did that ever get a sequel? No. And a sequel was talked about.
Well, that was partially because the screenwriter for that film got...
Oh, was he one of the ones that got Me Too?
Yes.
Okay.
But anyway, that's a good comparison, because obviously outside of that might be why it didn't get a sequel, but no one wanted a sequel, and no one is out there like, where's our Bright sequel?
Other than David Ayer stands, which do exist. They're not as important, vaster.
I mean,
as Zack
David Ayer
Snyder.
really is a B-Tech Zack Snyder.
No, he is.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Well, it's interesting though, because you're talking about the importance of Zack Snyder as a visual director, his kind of the atmosphere and I mean, I think visually is what I'm always drawn to with Zack Snyder. It's very specific, but like this film, this sort of double act, we'll call it one film, why not?
Yeah.
Feels deeply un-Zack Snyder in every other way apart from its ostentatious visual style.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't have any real personality to it
And
whatsoever.
even then, the visual style, I like.
It's
rewatching some old Zack Snyder, like rewatching 300. There are some genuinely like cinematically like beautiful shots. The way it's filmed is really contained, and everything is done for like the specific like to emulate that comic book. I think that's one of Zack Snyder's, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, but his ability to like adapt a frame of something and put it on screen is almost unparalleled. Like Watchmen is another great example where I already talked about in the previous review. Like I always think of the scene where he gets pushed out the window and you have that like cool slow motion shot with all the glass shattering. And I'm pretty sure like if you like compare that to the panel in Watchmen, if you read the comic, it's almost like that whole scene is like literally like frame for frame for frame.
Sure.
And the way he's adapted that is like genuinely like masterful. Like probably on a technical level, one of the most difficult things that you could do to do it as well as he did it.
Yeah.
And then I look at this film, I don't really see any of that visual like precision. Even like in a shit show like Batman vs Superman, there's some really cool shots in Batman vs Superman.
And again, I felt like he cared about that.
Yeah.
Like it was a mess, but he cared.
Yeah,
like
big
this
time.
one, I don't really feel that.
And it's not really very visually beautiful. You've got these like a lot of directors, Zack Snyder started out as like a commercials director, like directing adverts, and a lot of these like slow motion wheat shots. There's like Halifax adverts where it's like a horse running through a field.
Oh, it was like Lloyd's TSB.
Lloyd's TSB, where they have like the horse running through the field. A lot of like the shots in this, like of just wheat and like children laughing and playing and like people like walking around in a farm. It feels like one of those adverts to me. Like in a really, it's like really like superficial. We're a bank and we care about you adverts.
Oh, I really want to see that the wheat montage, but then into supercut into like
HSBC.
No, like vote Ron Dimmersdale for Libertarian governor. Like that sort of shit. I'll protect your crops. I'll protect your families. That sort of shit.
Wheat moons are the backbone of this solar system. Let me tell you, and I'm here to vote no on
Nazi wheat tax.
Oh God, yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, for the first time the other day, in preparation for our Zack Snyder tier list, we watched Sucker Punch, and again, like, there's quite a messy film. It's super scattershot, like he's got all these ideas kind of colliding, but it felt vibrant for all the problems I had with it on a narrative level. I was inherently like.
Yeah, again, it felt like he really cared.
I watched that film intently. I was like not distracted throughout, whereas this I was so profoundly bored. But so it's kind of like, as you know, I'm sure there will be Zack Snyder defenders watching this film, this video, being irate with us. In my mind, I feel like this is just like a really bad offering, even if you do love Zack Snyder.
No, I completely agree.
It doesn't really tap into anything I could see as being special about him.
Yeah, and I think Netflix's strategy of releasing it in two parts and having this whole then we're going to put the R-rated version out. And this kind of alludes to what I was saying about how good he is at adapting things. The reason people desperately wanted his version of Justice League is because whether you like it or dislike it, and I personally dislike Batman vs Superman, his adaptation of Batman vs Superman really did appeal to people. Even though it didn't do particularly well at the box office, there was a really, really passionate group of people out there, a non-insignificant group of people who really, really felt like he had been wronged by Warner Brothers. And I think they possibly partly had a point.
He had been wronged by them.
And you're never going to get that level of passion for something like this. And the fact that, number one, because the circumstances are completely different and Netflix is immediately planning to release the R-rated version, is not something that's being withheld. And this film is a new IP. The first film was shit, it got terrible reviews, and it didn't even get very good fan reactions for the most part. There's not going to be this grand hankering for it, to we need more Rebel Moon. So the fact that Netflix is trying to do this thing where it's like trying to kind of artificially replicate this, like release the Snyder Cut thing, but for its own property, is just like deeply, deeply embarrassing.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't really seen the parallel with that, but it's like, oh, if we keep just releasing Rebel Moon related material, like, I don't know, the names are out there.
I think, is that not what they're trying to do? Right? They're trying to just tap into that.
Maybe, I haven't really thought of it in those terms.
Because Zack Snyder's never going to go back to Warner Brothers after what happened.
Yeah,
so.
no, of course, yeah, maybe that's an interesting one. Yeah, I don't know if I fully agree.
I could be off base there, but that's just how
I can see the parallels for sure, yeah. And also trying to just constantly muster up, like, oh yeah, here's a version, but like the real artist's version, it's just around the corner. Yeah, it kind of slightly matches up,
Yeah, slightly. But anyways, what would you rate Rebel Moon?
I'd rate this, the second part the same as the first. 2 out of 10, just incredibly disposable. A smattering of mildly diverting moments throughout, but nothing that would ever get me to either rewatch the film in its entirety or even check out favourite scenes on YouTube. Like, there's nothing really here. For
me, it's a 1 out of 10. Like, I don't really think there's anything in either of these films that I thought was bordering on competent, really, let alone good. All of the good things that Zack Snyder can do as a director aren't present in either of these films, and all of the bad things that he could do are abundantly present. Both films felt like a very cynical waste of time for everyone involved. It feels a little bit embarrassing that they're trying to make this into this big series. Yeah, I just really hate both of these films.
That's entirely fair. It reads as a cynical rip-off of Star Wars. By rights, that is kind of all it is.
And if you want a cynical rip-off of Star Wars, just watch the Disney ones. You know what I mean?
Yeah, straight up. Yeah.
Like, if I want to watch a shit version of the original Star Wars films, or like, not shit, but a not as good version, I'll just watch The Force Awakens, because Disney did a mediocre Star Wars film first, and they did it better than Zack Snyder could. So yeah. Anyways, if you've enjoyed this review, give us a like, give us a follow. If you dislike this review, give us a dislike and tell us why. If you have any strong preferences or recommendations for us in the comments, let us know there. In any other case, I've been Rupert.
I've been Adam.
And we'll catch you on the next one. Peace.